Did you guys see today that Jared Goff got a new contract from the Detroit Lions? Puts him, depending on the fine print, puts him about 53 million in terms of annual average. Yeah, last week it was reported that Jordan Love is willing to wait out other quarterback deals to make sure that he can get up to the top of the new market. See the math, yeah. All I know is Jordan Love autographs are going to get more and more expensive. And that hurts. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Lombardi Time Brews, where I'm your host, John Delray. Yeah, it's true. Jared Goff making that new contract today, putting him at about $53 million on an average value. Now, it does depend because I haven't seen news broken down yet about the fine details, because Ken Ingles pointed out on Twitter that if it includes the money that he already had on his contract, then it's like a $46 million annual average. But nonetheless, as of right now, it's being reported as $53 million an annual average for Jared Goff. And that does probably figure into the contract that Jordan Love will inevitably get this offseason. So be ready for that. In terms of other Packer transaction news, just one today. The Packers wound up placing Trente Jones, the UDFA offensive lineman out of the University of Michigan. He was put on the reserve retired list. Generally just put on guys who are retiring, especially in the offseason. That's kind of what we see. So Trente Jones may be calling it quits from football. Now, he was projected to perhaps compete for an interior offensive line depth spot on the team at Michigan. He was mostly used as the sixth offensive lineman. So yeah, ultimately this is a UDFA who quite possibly is retiring now. Regardless, he's not going to be on the Packers anymore. And the Packers now suddenly have an open roster spot for the first time basically since signing UDFAs. So now a little bit of flexibility here. It'll be interesting to see ultimately what the Packers do and what kind of maneuvers they may make. So today we are talking 53-man roster of the Green Bay Packers, because the other day we did the offense. Now today it's time for defense and special teams. And just to give a quick preface, why are we doing this? Because to zoom out and look at the roster, others are zooming way in right now, looking at individual players. I wanted to zoom out, analyze where are the pinch points, as I've been calling them, on this roster. Where are the projected real battles that they're going to be? It's very easy for us to say, well, wide receiver 6 is going to be a battle. Well, I wanted to take a finer look at it and zoom in on who those players could be, how it might shake out. So we're taking a look at the defense today as well as the special teams. Now, in terms of the offense, what I predicted the other day, or the best guess, and keep in mind it is way too early to be doing this, but nonetheless, and again, I should say it's not so much the individual players, that we're kind of picking apart. It's more so seeing where the true log jams are. Some of these positions are going to be way easier than others. But I still put forth a guess of the offense the other day of 24 total offensive players. The Packers have done that in past years. Some years it's an even 25-25 split between offense and defense. But there's been years where it's 24 offense, 26 defense, and I think they wind up doing that again this year. So if you need to pause it if you're on the video format and take a look at who all I guessed there, it's broken up by wide receivers and tight ends, then the backs of different types, quarterbacks, running backs, and then, of course, over there, the offensive line. I know Michael Pratt has gotten more conversation. I said he was the toughest cut. He'd be going on the practice squad, and then eventually one of Sean Clifford and Michael Pratt's going to be on the move probably next offseason. So let's get to the defense, shall we? Let's dive right into the defense. Now, looking at the defensive tackles, the big guys on the defensive line, I'm going to declare a starter, who's on the roster, and then who also is the toughest cut. Kind of that guy that you don't feel good about predicting not going to be on the roster, but ultimately they can only keep so many. So in terms of starters, I think that's going to wind up being Kenny Clark and Devontae Wyatt. We've heard even, I believe it was Jason Rebrovich, one of the defensive line coaches of the team, talk about how he doesn't want to compare football to war, but the D-line, the DTs specifically, are now the Navy SEALs. They need to attack. They need to pursue. Kenny Clark and Devontae Wyatt in this new scheme, that fits right up their alley. Still on the roster, though, will be TJ Slayton, although admittedly, as it's been talked about by some of the assistant coaches, he's probably just not the most perfect fit. He's more of a true 3-4 defense or nose tackle. That's a little different than 4-3 defensive tackle in terms of where you're lining up, what your responsibilities are. He still certainly has a place on this team coming off of last year. He still certainly will be in a number of packages. But I think his starting spot is now a little bit more up for grabs. Then you also see Kobe Wooden, Carl Brooks, and then one of my most difficult keeps on the entire 53-man roster, Jonathan Ford, another year here. He's my toughest cut. And I just think, kind of like Slayton, he's more of a 3-4 nose. So now they're going to go with someone who's a little bit leaner. And that's kind of how the Packers like their defensive linemen anyway. So I go with James Esther, the UDFA, a guy who's been a captain for several years, back-to-back team MVP in college, coming in at 289 pounds, a little bit more the sizing that they like. Plus, keep in mind, you do have some versatility here with Wooden and Brooks, which I'm going to be talking about with this next position, which just happens to be our edge rushers, now defensive ends in the 4-3 base or 4-2-5 nickel, whatever. Now, with the starters, Preston Smith, Rashawn Gary, absolutely positively no shocks there, but it wouldn't shock me at all if Lucas Van Ness becomes a starter. Really, it's going to be the three of them in a very heavy rotation. Also making the roster, though, is Brenton Cox Jr., last year's UDFA out of Florida and Georgia. And then Kingsley Enagbare. Matt LaFleur said that it wasn't actually an ACL tear for Enagbare. And even though Enagbare himself said right after the injury that it was a tear, LaFleur also said that Enagbare didn't actually have surgery. I don't know what's going on here. But at the very least, we have not heard of Enagbare actually being on the field yet. So whether it was a tear or not, something was done to that knee, and he still isn't performing on the field from what we've heard. That just leads me to believe if this stretches into training camp, then we might very well be looking at some kind of IR pup situation, getting into the technicalities there of roster building. So 4 edge rushers feels very, very light. And realistically, what I probably would do here, assuming full health from Enagbare, is include him on the roster to give them 5 edge rushers and then only 5 defensive tackles and leave off Esther. But I think Esther is the guy that you kind of plug in there while Enagbare is out. Because in part, Kobe Wooden, Carl Brooks, they both have edge versatility. So when you're looking to go a little bit bigger on the D line in your 4-3 base or whatever the circumstances of a game call for, you can still trot out Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, and Carl Brooks at one of your defensive end spots. I think Esther holds a little bit more appeal or a little bit more want to hang on to the roster than the Packers' other edge options, because in this setting, they'd be letting go of Keyshawn Banks, Alexander, their International Pathway Program player, Edumagu, and then Aaron Mosby. And none of those names really do I feel the need, without seeing them on the field a lot right now, feel the need to latch onto and keep them on the roster. So Esther, I prioritized a little bit there. But I fully admit 4 edge feels very, very light. I think they're just going to temporarily cover for it if indeed Enagbare has to miss a bunch of time. Then moving on to the linebackers, a little bit tough here, but you're looking at starters in base, got to keep saying that. The starters of Quay Walker, Edgerrin Cooper, Isaiah McDuffie. I don't think there's any surprises there. But then also on the roster, one of your special teams aces, if not the most prolific of your special teams players, Eric Wilson. And then also Taron Hopper. Of course, he's a roster lock as well. The tough cut here for me was Raylan Goforth. 5 linebackers feel right. 6 wouldn't shock me. Raylan Goforth, UDFA, spent some time at USC, then ended his collegiate career at Washington. I think he's got the ability to be an absolute spark plug on special teams. But also cutting here was another teamer in Christian Welch, and then also Young. So this is basically how I decided to split it up. 5 linebackers felt right, but Goforth feels like a guy that may, as a UDFA, sneak onto the roster. Also, if you're looking for more edge versatility to help cover for 4, Quay Walker, Edgerrin Cooper, it's been talked about how they can blitz off of the edge. Now, not in a traditional 4-3, probably not going to have them put their hand in the dirt, but with maybe some different defensive configurations, they can help cover for edge temporarily that way as well. So now, moving on to the cornerback spot. Again, Starters here, it's murky at best. And it very well could be Stokes instead of Valentine, but here's what I went with for right now. Jerry Alexander, Carrington, Valentine, and Keyshawn Nixon as your actual starting three corners. Reason for Valentine over Stokes right now. Ultimately, Valentine is actually moving into a system that he's best suited for, being press man. When he came out of college from Kentucky, we all talked about how he's going to be best suited for press man. Well, now he's in the perfect situation. Stokes, no slouch at all in man coverage, but so much depends on his health there. And of course, we're going to know a lot better in August than we know now. But I like him. Valentine, Stokes, interchangeable. I'm good with it. And then also keeping 7th round pick Kalen King with the massive size chip on his shoulder. Now I do think he makes it, although I think he's a little bit more slot than anything else, than also keeping Corey Ballantyne, in large part because of how he filled in last year with all the cornerback injuries, but then also his special teams contributions. He's been valuable there now for 2 years. So I could absolutely see the Packers hanging on to him after choosing to re-sign him, hanging on to him as cornerback number 6. The tough cut here, Robert Rochelle. And kind of similar to Ballantyne, brought in at the midpoint of last year, granted a year later than Ballantyne, but a guy who did contribute here and there. He's probably the toughest of the cuts, but I think corner is relatively clean cut. And then also would be leaving off Jerron Green, the new player that they signed from the Giants, and Zion Gilbert. Moving on to the safety position. Oh, man, I love that picture. But you've got starters being Xavier McKinney and Javon Bullard. Brian Gutekunst himself said that Javon Bullard right now slots into their second safety spot. And then also on the roster, Keaton Oladapo, obviously. Evan Williams, obviously. And then last year's 7th round pick, Anthony Johnson Jr. And the way that I kind of like this is I know the Packers are not necessarily worried about free safety versus strong safety. They want their safeties to be completely interchangeable, which they can kind of do with McKinney and Bullard. The farther down you get in the depth chart, though, it does become a little bit different. Williams and Oladapo, realistically more strong safeties or box safeties. Anthony Johnson Jr., a more traditional free safety, center fielder, post safety, to use Hafley's new terms. But I think here, that's what you're looking at for the 5 to make the roster. The tough cut, Benny Sapp III. To me, that's absolutely the toughest cut here. Similarly to Bo Melton, when Sapp was called up last year and they signed him onto the active roster, they didn't do some temporary contract. They re-signed him for the 2024 season as well. They did the exact same thing with Melton. They do that for guys that they really like and want to make sure that they secure through the offseason. Well, I think with all of the safety infusions here, it does make it a lot tougher to keep Benny Sapp. Would it shock me if he's on the roster? No, not really. He could. There's a world where he could make it even over Anthony Johnson Jr., although I think Johnson Jr. still holds a much higher preference in their eyes. But still, nonetheless, this is what I'm thinking of your 5 safeties. This leaves off special teams ace Zane Anderson and then also Tyler Cole. And then moving on to the specialists, because they are a part of the team, the 3 specialists. I know. Scott, if you're watching, I'm very sorry. I think Anders Carlson gets the job. I know they're saying that kicker is an open competition right now. I know that. They brought in Greg Joseph to be Carlson's big competition, right? And they've got Podleski there as well. But really, it seems like the kicker competition is down to Anders Carlson and Greg Joseph. Joseph has the numbers career-wise, much like Carlson had last year. Slightly erratic with long stretches of being highly reliable and a very strong leg. The thing is, though, you gotta believe, based upon the potential, the fact that he's a lot younger, Carlson may have a higher ceiling than Joseph. So if they perform the same way, then the Packers would opt to keep their own draft pick in the form of Anders Carlson. So I think he does get the nod. Rich Bisaccia said in his interview last week that Carlson actually showed up to the camps that they've been doing, the workouts they've been doing. He showed up stronger this year. Now, Bisaccia didn't elaborate, but I guess the follow-up question that I would have had was it stronger in terms of overall leg strength for longer field goal quick kicks? Or does he mean stronger in the regard of more of a quick twitch style element and that his entire motion can become smoother, maybe faster? In that regard, I think it's an important distinction, I think, of which course, Bisaccia didn't really dive into much, but still, I think Carlson gets the job. At punter, you've only got one punter on the roster right now. It's in the form of Daniel Whelan, the Irishman. Yeah, he'll be there again. He was, and by basically every standard, he was at least an NFL average punter last year by several metrics in the top third. So he definitely secured another year. And then Peter Bowden, the long snapper out of Wisconsin, the UDFA. I think he just comes in. I think he performs better than Orzik. Now, Matt Orzik, when he was originally signed by Green Bay in the offseason, signed a 3-year contract. But last year was fairly disappointing. Was he as disastrous as other long snappers that we've seen? No, but still a lot of his placements, especially on field goal kicks, were quite often off, and it may have contributed to the operation, as Bisaccia calls it, ultimately faltering. So I think here the Packers go with Peter Bowden. With that being said, Bowden does seemingly have a couple things to work on. Bisaccia talked about how Bowden right now is working on increasing his snap speed, his snap velocity. Maybe that'll come into play. I still think Bowden winds up being more reliable than Orzik at this point, so put him on the roster. And then, of course, that leaves off Joseph and Orzik off the roster as well, Jack Podleski. So really, what does that do for us? That puts us, we are now complete with the roster, all 53, 3 specialists, 26 defensive players, and 24 offensive players. The toughest spots for sure on this roster, I only included 9 offensive linemen. It would not shock me in the least to see it be 10 offensive linemen, and the Packers do have a fair amount of precedent to do that as well. 9 feels light, but yet at the same time, giving Hafley all of the pieces necessary to instill this new defense. Plus, I think defensively, there's just some more interesting prospects that they're going to want to hang on to long term. So the best way to do that, keep them on your roster. The inclusion of James Esther at defensive line, that one was kind of difficult, but I still think the Packers may try to compensate for edge while Enagbare continues to heal up, if indeed he needs that time. If he doesn't need that time, then we may very well see 5 defensive tackles and 5 defensive ends if you choose to use that nomenclature right now. But then for linebackers, corner, safeties, those positions are honestly easier to predict at this juncture. There seem to be more clear-cut lines between guys who contributed, guys who would want to be held on to long-term, draft picks, etc., versus guys that have been on the practice squad before, or guys that just seem a tier down on the roster. So I said at the beginning that defense and special teams seems a little bit more clear-cut. I think it's true, minus maybe 1 or 2 maneuvers at the front 7. So there you have it. All 53 men laid out. Now, on Wednesday, it's not going to be LTB Live on Wednesday. Instead, it's going to be an episode. It kind of depends when the news gets leaked. I know the NFL is doing their reveal show, because that's a thing now. They're going to do a reveal show for the NFL schedule at 7 p.m. Central. I'm anticipating, like last year, there will be leaks from team reporters, beat writers, etc., that just happen to put out the Packers schedule before the NFL show, in which case I will be reporting that. I'm going to do a reaction to the schedule on Wednesday, and then LTB Live is going to be on Friday, hanging out, answering all your questions, talking about whatever you want about the Green Bay Packers. So that's going to be on Friday. I will put a note in the community section of the YouTube channel about when that will occur on Friday. So thanks so much for joining me here on Lombardi Time Brews. I am putting out a lot more graphics on Facebook and Instagram, so if that's of interest to you, go follow there. They're also going to be on Patreon if you'd consider joining that as well. But thank you for joining me, and as always, go Pack Go.